Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello, this is Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words in this introduction that's different from the rest of the program. Israelis were surprised by the recent study that 25% of U.S. Jews see Israel as an apartheid state, though one has to wonder who this unheard of group who did the study is and what its methodology was. And during the recent conflict with Gaza, some students at liberal rabbinical schools in the U.S. seem to have more sympathy with the Palestinians who launched the conflict than Jewish children huddling in bomb shelters in Israel's south. All of this has created a sense of unease among Israelis who wonder what's going on with the Jewish community in America. There's no simple answers. But clearly there are two opposing trends occurring in U.S. Jewry. Jews who have a knowledge of Jewish history, Torah, and tradition are still fully supportive of Israel. Others, including a large percentage who have been educated in Western liberal universities that are mostly hostile to Israel, have a variety of attitudes that range from indifference to hostilities. The deciding factor on how a person feels about Israel is how important Judaism is to them. In most cases, the less Judaism is important to a person, the less they care about Israel. At the Aliyah numbers of the U.S. Jews, 10% of U.S. Jews consider themselves Orthodox, yet 70% of U.S. immigrants to Israel are religious. The so-called crisis in the diaspora-Israel relations will not be found in more conferences. The building blocks of identity are an intellectual and spiritual appreciation of Judaism. But the more Jews know about Judaism, the more they will understand the value of a Jewish homeland. If Ben and Jerry had attended a Jewish school that imbued them with a love of Judaism and Israel, they would be creating new flavors instead of supporting the boycotts. Sadly, whatever Judaism they got was probably minimal and simplistic, and that is the problem we have in American Jewry, and that's probably why we're losing Ben and Jerry's. But that's only a symbol of the problem we have with the diaspora, lack of Jewish education. I'll be back after the break.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Zapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. I want to start the program this week with a few words about Ben and Jerry's ice cream. And my wife and I are great lovers of Cherry Garcia. I'm afraid we might have to live without it next year, but let's see what happens. In the meantime, I found an article about Ben and Jerry, and I want to share some of the highlights with the listeners because it says something about Ben and Jerry, and the readers can decide whether it's positive or negative. First, it says that After they graduated high school in 1969, Greenfield, one of the two, found himself sharing an apartment in the East Village with Cohen, which is the other of the B&J, who had dropped out of several colleges that he had enrolled in order to avoid the Vietnam War draft. So that's the first thing about his feelings toward war, which is okay. They settled in Burlington, where they did quite well. After 3 years, they were on the cover of Time magazine, particularly with Jerry Garcia. Today, these two, Ben and Jerry, Jerry Greenfield and Ben Cohen, are worth $150 million each, but are still courting controversy in the name of social justice. While they no longer have operational control of Ben & Jerry's, which they sold to a London-based conglomerate called Unilever back in 2000, they recently called the decision to boycott sales to Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza one of the most important decisions the company has made in its 43-year history. The boycott decision was made by the ice cream company's board, which retains autonomy over its brand and its business strategy. Unilever does not support the boycott. The boycott, which began July 19th, unleashed a political backlash in the United States and the Middle East, with Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett calling it glaring anti-Israel measure. In the United States, the Republican Senator of Oklahoma called for a ban on all Ben & Jerry sales in his state, and a New York congressman said that the boycott is about bowing to the liberal woke mob and anti-Israel, anti-Semitic hate. Last week, the pension fund for New York State workers warned Unilever it might restrict investments as a result of the ban. But Cohen and Greenfield have stood firm with their 6-member board's decision. They no longer sit on the company's board of directors. As our company began to expand internationally, they said, Israel was one of our first overseas markets. We were then and remain today supporters of the state of Israel, wrote Cohen and Greenfield in an opinion article for earlier this week. But it's possible to support Israel and oppose some of its policies, just as we've opposed policies of the U.S. government. As such, we support the decision to end sales in the occupied territory. Not only have Cohen and Greenfield backed the boycott, but they've donated hundreds of thousands in company profits over the years to groups working to promote Palestinian rights. Ben & Jerry's Foundation has doled out more than $100,000 in the last 2 years to the Oakland Institute think tank founded by Palestinian land rights activist Aruda Mittal, who is also chair of the ice cream company's board and vice president of the Ben & Jerry Foundations. Mittal is one of the architects behind the company's boycott in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, where there are more than 600,000 Jews scattered in about 140 settlements. The West Bank and East Jerusalem have been under Israeli control since the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Opponents of Israeli policy consider the settlements illegal, and they want to grant land rights to the Palestinians. Mittal has long been a fierce critic of Israel's policies. Her think tank, which includes a longtime Ben & Jerry's executive on its board, supported a controversial human rights group in the West Bank in 2017 with cash from the Ben & Jerry Foundation. The Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights received a $3,000 grant from the foundation, in 2017. Last year, the European Union pulled nearly $2 million worth of funding from Badil after it refused to sign an anti-terrorism clause. The clause stated that none of the EU's funds would be diverted to members of terrorist organizations like Hamas and Hezbollah. The Ben & Jerry's grant was used to finance a bold multimedia project on land rights to mark 50 years since the Six-Day War and Israel's occupation, according to the Oakland Institute's annual report. The report was entitled Palestine for Land and Life, and it documented individual stories of struggle. According to this document, across the West Bank, farmers lost their land, their livelihoods, and even their ability to visit their families when the separation wall was constructed. Under occupation, they also faced massive water shortages as Israel diverts water from the Jordan River to Israel and its settlements, unquote. By the way, what this anti-Israel pro-BDS article doesn't mention is that Israel also diverts a tremendous amount of water to Jordan, without which Jordan could not survive. Although the boycott has spawned a firestorm of criticism, as being anti-Semitic, that the Mital said that in spite of violent threats, she continues to stand the boycott, as do Greenfield and Cohen. We believe, she said, that business is among the most powerful entities in society. We believe that companies have a responsibility to use their power and influence to advance the wider common good, unquote. Now, I would like to quote a letter to the Jerusalem Post that I wrote that was published on August 2nd, and it says the following. There was an article that was attempting to explain and even justify the controversy surrounding the international director of Ben & Jerry's upcoming boycott, which actually exposes the magnitude of the prevailing abject ignorance about the history of the Middle East and in particular the Israel-Palestinian conflict. This article explaining the B&J boycott uses the word occupation 6 times to describe Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria. In fact, Israel's presence is a result of the recognized defensive war in 1967 against a number of Arab nations, including Jordan, which was indeed occupying the area illegally since 1948 in violation of United Nations decisions. In addition, illegal occupation can be done only in the region of a sovereign entity. A situation did not exist since the Palestinians had taken no action to establish sovereignty after the November 1947 UN decision to divide the area that had been under a British mandate and which the British had abandoned. All this is in addition to the original violation by Great Britain of the 1922 League of Nations mandate to prepare Palestine for Jewish sovereignty. To date, the government of Israel has failed in its responsibility to make the international community aware of the realities in this entangled corner of the world. Unquote. That was my letter. The bottom line is that a lot of people, including Ben & Jerry, who are very good-hearted and they want to do good and they have a record of doing good all around the world, simply are totally ignorant of the realities of this area of the world. They have no idea of the history of the Palestinian or Arab conflict with Israel, and therefore they take actions which would make sense if they were dealing with something which they understood the facts on the ground. The problem is that many people, including Ben & Jerry's, simply have no idea of what's going on here in our corner of the world, and therefore they take actions which they think are beneficial and make sense, and they are do-gooders. And the word do-gooders is generally used for people who really want to do good, but they simply have no idea what they're talking about. So Ben and Jerry's is in that category. Unfortunately, it's a shame. They have a lot of money to do good things with, but they simply, in our case, simply do not know what they're talking about, and it's sort of tragic. In a sense, they're supporting terrorism. I'll be back after the break.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with Love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with Love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. Since in the first segment of the program this week, I mentioned the total ignorance of Ben and Jerry of what's happening here in the Middle East, I thought it might be a good time to remind the listeners of something which they should know, but they might need reminding, and that is our relationship with the Palestinian Arabs. And there were some very thorny questions in our relationship. For example, when will the Palestinian Arabs recognize Israel as the national home of the Jewish people? For 73 years, the Arabs have steadfastly refused to accept the Jewish state anywhere in the Holy Land. They preserve the hope that someday the Jews will be driven out. And indeed, according to a recent poll, 57% of Palestinians believe their main national goal should be a one-state solution, reclaiming all of the land of Palestine from the river to the sea, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. Now, it's obvious that the Palestinians don't want a two-state solution. So why should Western countries like the United States insist on something that most Palestinians themselves don't want? Now, in addition, there are several other issues that we have to remind ourselves of. Ever since Hamas, the Muslim terror group, won the Palestinian elections back in 2006, and then they violently seized Gaza, Hamas has waged war with the ruling Fatah party, which rules only in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. Not only are Gaza and the West Bank separated geographically, but for the last 15 years, these two factions have fought bitterly, despite the peace efforts and those of other Arab nations to make peace between them. So until Fatah and Hamas declare peace between them, Israel has no negotiating partner. At the moment, Hamas controls Gaza and is today allied with Iran. Both Hamas and Gaza advocate Israel's destruction, and they're spending tens of millions of dollars supporting anti-Israel terrorist attacks. So you have to ask ourselves, how can Israel achieve security when the Hamas charter itself and its every action focus on eliminating Israel by military force? Now, another thing to take into account is democracy in the Palestinian area. Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, was elected to a 4-year term in 2005. He has now served since 2005 without standing for election a second time, and neither Palestinians in Judea, Samaria, nor Gaza have held national elections since 2006. They are totalitarian entities. So the question is, to establish a new Arab state, would it be anything other than an Arab dictatorship? And would this help create peace? Another thing that has to be taken into account is the Palestinian economy. While the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza have received literally billions of dollars in aid from the United States, from the European Union, and from other Arab states, neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority has invested in any infrastructure sufficient to create viable economies. Right now, employment is in the West Bank under Mahmoud Abbas is close to 20%, and in Gaza under Hamas it's a little bit over 50%. Without massive international welfare, both these entities would collapse. As a matter of fact, literally tens of thousands of Arabs, particularly from Judea and Samaria, either work in Jewish factories or other Jewish institutions in those areas, or they come into Israel every day for jobs. There are no jobs available under the Palestinian Authority. Now, also, at the moment, Hamas clearly has superior military might over the Palestinian Authority. How do we know this? Because Hamas took over Gaza violently in 2007. Now today it has more than 20,000 men under arms, and it has tens of thousands of rockets. It also has a well-organized political arm, and it is supported financially by Iran. If a Palestinian state were formed under the Palestinian Authority, how could the United States or Israel or Jordan or Egypt protect the new state from a coup by Islamic Hamas terrorists? In other words, the truth of the matter is that the Palestinian Authority stays in place because it's protected by Israel. Were it not for Israel's protection, it would have been taken over by Hamas. And now there's an even more basic question. Like many Middle East dictatorships, neither the Palestinians neither of these two Palestinian areas, one under Hamas and the other under the Palestinian Authority, neither of them support civil rights, as we know, or rule of law, as we know in the West. The UN Special Coordinator has reported that in Palestinian jurisdictions, conditions for rule of law are non-existent. Human Rights Watch, there's an organization called Human Rights Watch, and it reports that the Palestinian Authority is arresting, abusing, and criminally charging journalists who express peaceful criticism. That's beside what goes on in Hamas, which they don't even seem to know. Civilian security in both territories is completely outside of civilian control. Now, there could well be that a two-state solution seemed reasonable. For example, when it was suggested by the League of Nations back in 1939, and indeed in 1948 when the UN voted for a two-state solution, and Israel picked up on it and established the State of Israel. The Arabs did nothing. Now, and then after Israel was founded, the Palestinians were offered very generous peace offers by Israel in 2000, in 2001, and 2008. Before Hamas seized Gaza and launched 3 wars against Israel. And this is all before Iran became a regional cancer, before the Syrian and Yemeni civil wars, before ISIS and Qaeda, and before 16 years of corrupt rule in the Palestinian Authority by Mahmoud Abbas. In other words, there is no history of democracy under any Palestinian leadership, neither in Gaza nor in the West Bank, neither under Hamas or under the Palestinian Authority, and there is no education in their educational system toward democracy. These are very major problems. These are very fundamental, basic problems. As long as these problems exist, and for the foreseeable future it appears they're going to exist, there is absolutely no idea of a two-state solution. You cannot defend the idea of a two-state solution. As a matter of fact, if you support a two-state solution, you're being irresponsible and dangerous. The Palestinians have done nothing whatsoever to create a democratic society, to teach, to educate their children since 1994. Since the Oslo Agreement, they have done nothing to educate their children who are now adults, those who were kids in 1994. They have done nothing to educate them toward democracy. They have done nothing to establish democratic institutions. They have done nothing to provide work for their own people. They live on handouts and they live on propaganda. So once in a while, we have to remind ourselves of the situation as it is. I'll be back after the break.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Ben-Tekoa, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words about the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Visitors and Israelis and people from all over the world come to what's known as the Western Wall, which is really a support wall for the temple that existed there. That's the site where the first and second temples in ancient times were located, and where, according to the Bible, Abraham bound Isaac and Jacob had his dream of a ladder reaching the heavens. And according to the Talmud, the entire world was created from the temple area. But it is also Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary in Islamic tradition for where Muhammad prays and ascended to heaven, at a site upon which the Al-Aqsa Mosque was built, which is now considered one of the holiest sites in Islam. Tensions have long surrounded the site due to its importance for Muslims and as a national symbol and a rallying point for Palestinians. After the Six-Day War, when Israel captured the old city, Dayan, the defense minister, handed the keys to the Temple Mount over to the Waqf, which is the Muslim religious authority. And as a result, tensions have long surrounded the site due to its importance for Muslims as a national symbol and a rallying point for Palestinians. And one of our, Arik Sharon, as a member of the Israeli government, visited the site several years ago, and it generated severe riots, which eventually morphed into the Second Intifada. And now there are efforts to shore up a rickety bridge called the Mughrabi Bridge, which is the only access point for non-Muslims. And when Jews are there, they're frequently met with demonstrations and violence by Palestinians who are encouraged by religious and political leaders. Just several months ago, tensions between Jews and Arabs surrounding Jerusalem boiled over when police clashed with Palestinian rioters on the Temple Mount, and the police even entered Al-Aqsa Mosque, firing tear gas inside the building. And Hamas, the terror organization, used this incident as a proximate cause to the rockets that fired rockets at Jerusalem, and that initiated the latest round of conflict between Israel and Gaza back in May. Although the terrorist group had ulterior motives for igniting a conflict, Israeli Arabs took the streets in protest against what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque, leading to the worst Jewish-Arab intercommunal violence in 2 decades, including in the city of Lud, which is a mixed city, Arabs and Jews. A lot of Jews moved out because of it. Because of the combustible nature of the holy site, the police for many years showed little sympathy or accommodation to Jewish visitors, seeing Jewish visitors as troublemakers who could easily spark conflict. Although the High Court of Justice here in Israel ruled that Jews have the right to pray at the site, the High Court also gave the police the authority to deny the right if they believed Jewish prayer would damage the security situation. And the police used this ruling to impose a blanket ban on Jewish prayer while doing little to make Jewish visitation a more comfortable experience. I've been there myself several times. Now, positive change has occurred in the last several years, and Jewish prayer is now conducted on the Temple Mount. The services are conducted in an unhurried manner, and they're conducted in full view of a Waqf official, that is, an official of the Muslim religious court, and there is always one of these Waqf officials trailing the non-Muslim groups who now stand some 10 meters away from this guard. For more than 2 years now, twice a day for the morning and afternoon services, a group of Temple Mount activists gathers on the eastern side of the esplanade and stands facing the site of the former temple and prays. They do so in a discreet manner in an area that is not visible from the main area of visitation on the rest of the site, but it is in the full sight of the police, who allow groups to stop and pray for an extended period of time these days. Some prayers that need to be recited aloud, such as Kaddish, are said out loud, and ample time is given to the worshippers to complete their prayers. However, the use of prayer shawls, a talit, and the wearing of tefillin is banned. Prostration and bowing of any kind are completely forbidden, as are almost all forms of demonstrative prayer. The one exception to demonstrative prayers appears to be the penitential tachanun prayers said at the end of the morning and afternoon services, where individuals rest their head on their arm and recite a confession, a practice that the police allow. Given the extreme sensitivity of the site and the long-held vehement opposition of Muslim leaders and Palestinian and Jordanian officials against Jewish prayer on the Temple Mount, the fact that prayer services can now place in this manner is without doubt a radical change from the status quo that held sway for many years since Israel captured the old city of Jerusalem in 1967. Now, there are a lot of activists, Jewish activists, and many of the leading activists ascribe the positive change to the large rise in Jewish visitors to the holy site over the last 5 years. They've been working hard for the last 20 years to increase number of visitors, and in 2016, their campaign got its biggest boost. The Likud member of Knesset, Gilad Erdan, was appointed public security minister, which is the cabinet post with authority over the police, and he embarked on a series of measures to create a more accommodating atmosphere at the site. One of his first measures was to ban a group called the Murabitit group back in 2015, who scream, yell, and harass Jewish visitors, and that was one of the greatest causes of discomfort on the Mount and one of the primary factors that dissuaded many people from visiting. Additionally, when the term of the Jerusalem District Police Commander ended in 2016, Erdan specifically sought a replacement who would be sympathetic to Jewish visitors and replaced the police officer charged with control of the entrance to ensure a change in attitude of the police at that sensitive gateway to the Temple Mount. Before these and other changes were made, Jewish visitors every year numbered a few thousand. They reached a peak of 13,800 in 2016, but in 2017 that number rose to 25,000, reached a peak of just over 30,000 in 2019, which was the last full year before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, there is a yeshiva, the Temple Mount Yeshiva. The head of it is a Rabbi Eliyahu Weber. His students visit the site on a daily basis to pray and study, and he says that he has no doubt that the increasing numbers of visitors drove the change in attitude to Jewish visitors at the site by the government and by the police, because presence, he says, defines a place. If Jews are not present in a place, that's not Jewish. That's the reality. And he further went on to say that when only a few Jews used to go up, the Jews were defined as visitors. But the Jewish presence created a reality in which Jews are now defined as locals. Now, he's certainly correct that visiting the Temple Mount is a much more pleasant experience than it used to be, but the rabbi and the rest of the Temple Mount activist movement seek further improvements still for those who go up to this holy place. The visiting hours are still severely limited. Entrance is prohibited on Shabbat. Prayer shawls and tefillin cannot be used, and the prayer services themselves are still noticeably guarded event in which it feels as though something clandestine is being performed. Indeed, the activists are trying to stretch the boundaries as far as they can all the time. In 2019, before the pandemic, the Temple Mount was open to Jewish visitors for the first time during a Muslim holiday, El Adha. The Waqf did everything it could to thwart the ascent of Jewish visitors on that day, with mosques closed in the rest of Jerusalem. The Muslim morning prayer service delayed to coincide with the non-Muslim visiting hours, and Palestinians told not to disperse after the prayer service to make sure there were a lot of Muslims present. Nevertheless, the police decided to allow Jewish visitors to ascend, and despite that, a riot by Palestinian demonstrators, but the police persisted in their policy, and Jewish visitation occurred even on tense days. So there's been some improvement. We took over the Temple Mount back in 1967. We gave away the key to the Muslim authorities, and now we're doing what we can to improve and increase Jewish presence on the holiest site of Judaism. So that's the status right now. It's a source of tension, but the activists are doing what they can to make Jewish presence a real thing. Thanks for listening. Jay Shapiro signing off.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.